The carriage wheels groaned against the wet cobblestones as dusk fell over Winthorpe Manor. Beyond the cliffs, the sea howled like a wounded creature, crashing against the black rocks below. The great estate loomed ahead, its stone towers lost in mist, its windows dark and unwelcoming, a fortress of sorrow more than a home. Inside that carriage sat Duke Alaric Blackwell, returning at last from the wars that had nearly consumed him. His once proud face was now lined with exhaustion, his uniform threadbare, a faint scar tracing the edge of his cheek like a reminder of every nightmare he had survived. The war had ended, but for Alaric, the battle within never ceased. He had watched men fall beside him, heard the final cries of comrades and enemies alike, and returned home not as a hero, but as a ghost still wearing a man's skin. His wife, Lady Helena, had died while he was away, an illness that took her swiftly, cruelly, before his letters could reach her. He never saw her again. And when the messenger brought him the news, he had fallen to his knees in the mud of France and made a vow that chilled even his soul. He would never love again. As his carriage drew to a stop before the manor gates, Alaric looked out at the iron crest that bore his family name. Once it had filled him with pride. Now it only mocked him. The butler, Mr. Hayworth, opened the door with trembling hands, bowing deeply. "Welcome home, Your Grace," he said, though his voice quavered. Home. The word was hollow. Inside, the manor was silent. Tapestries hung heavy with dust, the grand piano in the drawing-room was draped in a white sheet, and even the fire refused to burn brightly, as though mourning alongside its master. The servants moved quietly, avoiding eye contact. No laughter echoed through the halls, no music, no life. Alaric's boots left a trail of mud across the marble floor as he ascended the staircase to his chamber. On the wall hung a portrait, Helena painted in brighter days, her smile soft and radiant. He stopped before it, his hand trembling. "I kept my promise," he murmured. "No love, no joy, only memory." His reflection in the glass looked nothing like the man she once knew. Later, alone in his study, he stared into the dying fire. The storm outside battered the windows, wind howling through the old manor's bones. The sound reminded him of cannon fire, of screams, of loss. He pressed a hand against his chest, where a locket once hung, now empty. He had buried it with her. And yet, as he closed his eyes, he heard something he could not explain. Faint, soft, not wind, not thunder, a voice, a woman's voice, distant and low, singing through the storm. He stood abruptly, his heart racing. It couldn't be. He followed the sound through the hallways until he reached the chapel, a small candlelit space long abandoned since Helena's passing. There, kneeling before the altar, was a young woman, Evelina Hart, newly arrived as governess to his niece. Her head was bowed, her hands clasped in prayer, her soft voice trembling as she spoke. "Lord," she whispered, "heal the man who lives among shadows. Give peace to the heart that has forgotten its own pulse." Alaric froze in the doorway, every muscle in his body taut. He should have left. He should have scolded her for intruding into what was sacred to his grief, but something in her tone, that fragile compassion, that quiet defiance of sorrow, struck through the cold wall around his heart. When her eyes opened, she gasped to see him there. "Your Grace, I didn't hear—" He turned away before she could finish. "Do not pray for me," he said, his voice low, hoarse. "God does not listen to the damned." And he left her there, kneeling beneath the candlelight, her prayer still echoing through the empty hall long after he was gone. But that night, as he lay awake in his chamber, her words haunted him. For the first time in years, he dreamed not of war, but of peace. The morning after that storm carried a strange stillness, one that neither the servants nor their master could name. The Duke rose early, as he always did, to read reports and correspondence. He would never answer. Yet that day, something was different. Beneath the dull scratching of his quill and the groaning timbers of Winthorpe Manor, he thought he heard a faint hum, the same voice from the night before. It drifted through the corridors like light under a locked door. He told himself it was the wind, nothing more. Still, his hand shook when he tried to dip his pen in ink. His mind would not stay with the figures and signatures before him. It returned again and again to that chapel, to the sound of that woman's voice trembling in prayer. Evelina Hart had come to Winthorpe only 3 days earlier, a woman of modest means but uncommon courage. Orphaned young, she'd been educated by the church and found purpose in teaching children and tending to those in sorrow. Her letters of reference had impressed the housekeeper, Mrs. Holloway, who hired her to tutor the Duke's niece, Clara, a lonely child who barely spoke since her mother's death. Evelina had expected coldness, perhaps even cruelty from her new master, but not this level of grief. Every servant she met moved as if fearing to breathe too loud. Every portrait in the gallery seemed to watch her with eyes painted in mourning. And the Duke himself, she had seen him only once, that night in the chapel, standing like a shadow come to life. At breakfast, the staff whispered about him. "His Grace hasn't smiled since the war," murmured the maid, polishing the silver. "He bans music," said another. "Even laughter, says it disturbs the dead." Evelina frowned at that. "The dead are at peace," she said gently. "It's the living who need music." Later that morning, she took little Clara to the manor gardens, though winter had stripped them bare. The odd child clung to her doll and refused to speak, but Evelina knelt beside her and whispered, "Did you know flowers sleep too? But when the sun returns, they always rise again." The girl blinked, perhaps too young to understand the words, but she reached for Evelina's hand. It was the first touch of trust in months. From the upper balcony, Alaric watched them unseen. He had meant only to check on the grounds, but his gaze caught on the figure of Evelina kneeling beside his niece, her cloak lifting in the cold wind, her voice low and patient. She reminded him painfully of the light Helena once brought into these same gardens, and for that reason alone, he despised the feeling. That night, unable to sleep, Alaric found himself drawn again toward the chapel. He told himself it was to ensure no one disturbed it, but in truth, he wanted to hear that voice again. The candlelight flickered as he entered. Empty. Only the faint scent of lavender and wax remained. He turned to leave. Then he saw it, a folded scrap of paper left upon the altar. A prayer, her handwriting neat and small. For the soul that cannot forgive itself, for the heart that no longer believes it deserves love, may it find mercy. He read it twice. His chest tightened as though someone had reached inside and pressed against his wounds. He crushed the paper in his fist and turned away, but could not bring himself to throw it into the fire. The next morning, when Evelina entered the library to fetch a book for Clara, she found the Duke there. She froze at the doorway. He looked up slowly, his eyes sharp but weary. "You were in the chapel last night," he said. It was not a question. She swallowed. "Yes, Your Grace." "You prayed for me." Her gaze dropped. "I prayed for peace, Your Grace, for all who live without it." The silence between them stretched thin. He should have rebuked her, but something, perhaps the honesty in her tone, stopped him. "Do not waste your prayers," he said finally, his voice softer than she expected. "God left this house long ago." Evelina met his eyes then, and for a heartbeat, neither looked away. "Then I shall ask him to return." He turned sharply, as if her words were a weapon. "You are bold for a governess." "Hope often is, Your Grace." She curtsied and left him standing there, his pulse unsteady, her words lingering in the air like the faintest trace of perfume. For the first time in years, the Duke realized he no longer hated the sound of a woman's voice. Days passed, and the chill that once claimed Winthorpe Manor began to shift. Imperceptibly at first, like the first crack in ice when winter surrenders to spring. Yet for the servants who had long tiptoed through its endless halls, even a faint change felt like a miracle. The laughter of a child was heard once more, soft but real, drifting from the nursery where Evelina Hart sat reading beside the fire. It started with a book of fables. Clara Blackwell, the Duke's niece, had been silent since her mother's passing, her small voice buried under fear and loneliness. But Evelina knew that silence could be taught to sing again if met with patience. One morning, she turned the pages of The Little Oak and the Storm, her tone lilting and alive, describing how a tree survived by bending with the wind. Clara's tiny lips moved, a whisper, then a word. "The tree didn't break?" Evelina's eyes glistened. "No, my dear. It learned how to stand again." From the doorway, Duke Alaric Blackwell watched. He had not meant to linger, but something about the governess's calm voice drew him like a forgotten memory. The sight of his niece smiling, actually smiling, tightened something deep in his chest. He left before they saw him, unwilling to admit that warmth could still reach him. Later that day, he entered the drawing room for the first time in years. Dust sheets still covered the furniture, and cobwebs draped from the corners like mourning veils. The grand piano stood in silence beneath its ghostly shroud. For a moment, he almost reached out to lift the cover, but his hand froze halfway, haunted by memory. Behind him came a quiet voice. "It's a fine instrument, Your Grace." He turned sharply. Evelina stood in the doorway, holding a tray of tea she had brought for Clara. She hesitated only briefly before stepping closer. "Music, it helps a house breathe," she said gently. His tone was cold. "Music brings ghosts. That piano will remain silent." Evelina's gaze lowered, but her reply was steady. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but silence can be the crueler ghost." He stared at her, anger rising, but beneath it, confusion. No one had dared speak to him so plainly in years. "You presume much, Miss Hart." "Only that grief does not vanish when we lock the doors against it," she said softly. "It lingers until we face it." Her courage unsettled him. Most people spoke to him as one might to a storm, carefully, cautiously, but she looked at him like a man, not a monster. It disarmed him more than any enemy ever had. That night, he found himself pacing the corridors, her words echoing in his mind. He could still hear her voice, warm, firm, alive. He paused at the landing, gazing down toward the chapel door. He knew he should banish her for her insolence, and yet he didn't. In the servants' quarters below, Evelina sat by candlelight, writing in her small journal. "He is not cruel," she wrote. "He is wounded, the kind of wound that bleeds inward, unseen. If he has forgotten how to hope, then I must remind him." When she closed the book, a soft draft stirred the candle flame. The manor seemed to sigh around her, as if acknowledging her vow. The next morning, Evelina began opening the shutters in rooms long sealed. Sunlight crept across paintings and bookshelves untouched for years. Servants stared as she worked, uncertain whether to stop her, but her gentle authority seemed to grant them courage. Before noon, the great hall smelled of fresh air and wildflowers again. By mid-afternoon, the Duke returned from the stables and froze at the sight. Light streamed through the high windows, dancing across marble floors that had not seen day in a decade. His expression darkened. "Who ordered this?" Evelina, standing by the stairs, turned calmly. "I did, Your Grace." He stepped closer, each word clipped. "I forbid change in this house without my consent." "You forbade life, not change," she said, her tone respectful yet unflinching. "And forgive me, but the two are not the same." The silence that followed was sharp enough to break glass. Servants scattered, pretending not to listen. The Duke's jaw tightened. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he said nothing. He simply turned and walked away. That night, he did not dine alone. Instead, he requested supper be sent to the small study near the chapel, the one Evelina had cleaned days before. And though neither spoke of it, both knew something unseen had shifted. The house no longer feared sound. For the next few days, Winthorpe Manor seemed caught between two worlds, one of shadow and one of dawn. The servants whispered that the air itself felt different, that the Duke no longer walked as though carrying the dead upon his shoulders. But to Alaric Blackwell, the change was not peace, it was discomfort. The quiet hum of life returning to the manor scraped against his grief like sunlight through a cracked window. He wanted the silence back. He wanted to believe his heart could stay dead. Yet every time he passed the corridor near the chapel, he heard Evelina's voice, reading to Clara, humming as she dusted, sometimes even laughing. That laughter struck him hardest. It wasn't loud or careless, it was soft, alive, a sound that belonged to a world he thought he'd buried with Helena. One morning, while inspecting the gallery, Evelina found a section draped in heavy velvet. The dust on the curtain was thick, untouched for years. Curiosity tugged at her. When she drew it aside, a portrait was revealed, a woman with golden hair and eyes full of light, painted in the bloom of youth. Her smile seemed to reach out of the canvas, gentle yet haunting. Beneath it read the inscription, Lady Helena Blackwell, beloved wife. Evelina stood still, the weight of the name pressing against her heart. So this was the ghost that ruled the manor, the woman whose absence had turned a man into stone. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned quickly and froze. The Duke stood at the other end of the gallery, his expression dark as a storm. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low but dangerous. She lowered her gaze. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I didn't mean to intrude. I was looking where you shouldn't," he cut in, crossing the distance between them in measured strides. "That portrait is not to be uncovered. Ever." Evelina's hands trembled, but her voice remained calm. "She's beautiful," she said softly. "It's clear you loved her deeply." He stopped short, anger and sorrow colliding in his eyes. "Love?" he said bitterly. "Love killed her." The words stunned her. "You cannot mean—" "I left her here," he said, his tone sharp, eyes fixed on the portrait. "I went to war for honor, for duty, for this cursed name, and while I was gone, the fever came. She died alone in this house, writing letters that never reached me. I came home to find her buried before I even knew she was ill." His voice cracked, the sound raw and human. "If love is what binds us, then it is also what breaks us, and I have had enough of both." Evelina's heart ached at the confession. "You blame yourself," she whispered. He turned on her. "Wouldn't you?" The question rang through the hall like a whip. Even the portrait seemed to recoil. For a moment, Evelina almost stepped back, but she didn't. She met his gaze with quiet strength. "I would mourn," she said, "and I would forgive myself, because love doesn't end with loss, Your Grace. It waits. It hopes." His jaw clenched. He wanted to shout, to silence her words, but something inside him refused to. He looked away, shoulders shaking, one hand gripping the frame of his wife's portrait as though it were a lifeline. Evelina's eyes softened. "You punish yourself for surviving. But maybe you were meant to. Maybe her love didn't die with her. Maybe it lives through what you do next." He gave a broken laugh. "You think love can rise from the grave?" "I think love never left you," she said quietly. "You just buried it too soon." He stared at her for a long, silent moment, his breath uneven. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Evelina watched him go, her own heart heavy. She hadn't meant to wound him, but sometimes truth must bruise before it heals. That night, in the solitude of his chamber, Alaric poured himself a glass of brandy. His reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger, weary eyes, scarred cheek, a man halfway between past and present. On his desk lay a sealed drawer. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside lay a stack of unsent letters, each bearing the name Helena. The ink had long faded, but the pain within was fresh. He read the first line aloud, voice barely above a whisper. "My dearest heart, if I do not return, know that I was already gone the day you stopped waiting." He closed the letter and pressed it against his chest, the ache unbearable. But beneath it all, something new stirred, a memory of a woman kneeling in the chapel, praying for his soul. And for the first time, Alaric wondered if God truly had left this house, or if he had simply sent someone to find it again. The morning after their confrontation, the air within Winthorpe Manor hung heavy, charged, with a silence that was no longer cold, but fragile. It was the kind of silence that follows an earthquake, when the ground still trembles beneath one's feet, though all seems still. The servants avoided speaking of it, but every eye turned to the Duke whenever he entered a room. They sensed something had changed, something in him. For his part, Alaric Blackwell found himself restless. Every attempt at reading, every effort to return to his routines, dissolved into distraction. He caught himself listening for footsteps in the hall, for the faintest trace of Evelina's voice. She had said things to him no one had dared, truths that hurt like confession, and yet he could not forget the way her eyes had looked when she said them, not accusing, not pitying, but believing. Meanwhile, in the schoolroom, Evelina taught Clara her lessons with quiet devotion, though her thoughts often wandered to the Duke. She regretted uncovering the portrait, yet she knew that moment had been necessary. Sometimes a wound must be revealed before it can close. Still, his anguish haunted her. She had seen grief before, but not like his. His pain was not that of a man mourning another. It was the agony of one who believed he had killed love itself. That afternoon, while searching the library for a children's book, Evelina's fingers brushed a loose panel along the bottom shelf. It clicked under her touch, and a small compartment slid open. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Her breath caught. The topmost envelope was addressed in the Duke's elegant hand, "To my dearest Helena." She hesitated. Every instinct told her to close the drawer and walk away. But another voice whispered, perhaps his wife's, perhaps her own, read and understand. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the first page. The ink was smudged with water stains as though once touched by rain or tears. "My beloved, the war grows darker by the day, yet I see your face in every dawn, your voice in every moment of silence. If I fall, know that I fought not for the crown, but to be worthy of you." Evelina's eyes blurred. Another letter followed, written later, the words harsher, more desperate. "Helena, the world here reeks of death. I dream of you calling my name, and I wake to find only mud and smoke. If I should live, will I still be the man you loved, or will I bring the war home with me?" Then the final one, dated weeks before her death. "I have no word from you, no letter, no whisper. Have you forgotten me? Perhaps this is justice. I left you behind for honor and came home to shame. If you no longer wait, I understand. Maybe love was never meant for men like me." The ink stopped abruptly, as if the pen had fallen mid-stroke. Evelina pressed the letters against her heart. They weren't love notes. They were a man's confessions, pieces of his soul written in exile and buried in guilt. She spent the evening in the chapel, the letters beside her, the candles casting golden halos of light. Kneeling before the altar, she whispered, "He doesn't know you still listen." She placed the letters gently on the marble, tied again with their ribbon, and beside them laid a single wildflower from the winter garden, a bloom that had dared to grow in frost. Then, on a small slip of paper, she wrote her own message. "Your Grace, these words were never meant to die in darkness. They belong to the light, to healing, not regret. You once wrote that love was never meant for men like you, but love is not given to the deserving. It is given to the willing." E.H. When dawn came, the Duke found himself drawn once more to the chapel, as though something unseen beckoned him. The air inside felt different, alive. Upon the altar, the ribbon of blue caught his eye. His breath faltered as he recognized his own handwriting. He opened the letters one by one until her note slipped free. He read it once, then twice. His hand shook. He could see her in the words, her grace, her courage, her impossible kindness, and for the first time in years he felt the unbearable urge to weep. But instead of tears, a single broken laugh escaped him, not of joy, not of mockery, but of astonishment. "She dares," he whispered. "She dares to believe there's light left in me." He gathered the letters and pressed them against his chest. The warmth of them, the faint scent of her hand, lingered like prayer. That evening, when he saw her in the corridor, he stopped her with a single sentence that made her heart freeze and flutter all at once. "You went through my past," he said quietly. "Be careful, Miss Hart. You might awaken it." Evelina met his gaze and bowed her head. "Perhaps it needs awakening, Your Grace." He should have been furious. He wasn't. He only stood there, silent, as though trying to remember how to breathe. Later, as he poured himself another drink, he noticed the blue ribbon lying beside the glass, untied, fluttering like the first loosened thread of a tightly bound heart. And somewhere deep within him, a door began to open. The sky over Winthorpe Manor had been dark all afternoon, but when the first roll of thunder broke, it was like the voice of heaven itself. The storm that came that night was unlike any the coast had seen in years. Wind lashed against the windows, rain struck the walls in furious rhythm, and lightning lit the cliffs like burning veins of silver. To the servants, it was a night to stay inside, close to the fire. But to Evelina Hart, it was a night that demanded faith. She had been in the chapel when the storm began, lighting candles and wiping the moisture that leaked through the old roof. The chapel was her refuge now, her quiet rebellion against despair. There she had prayed each evening for the Duke, for the house, for every restless soul beneath that roof. But as the thunder grew, the wind tore a section of the roof free. Rain poured. Through the gap like a broken dam, she cried out, trying to cover the altar with her shawl to protect the letters she had left there only days before. They were his, sacred in their sorrow. She could not bear to see them lost. At that same moment, Duke Alaric Blackwell sat in his study, staring at the empty hearth. The storm outside felt familiar, almost comforting. For years he had carried the storm within him. Now the world simply reflected it. But then, a faint sound, not thunder, not the sea, a voice. "Your Grace!" cried one of the footmen, bursting into the room. "The chapel roof's giving way. Miss Hart, she's still inside." Alaric was on his feet before the man finished. His chair toppled behind him. He didn't stop for a coat. The corridors flashed with lightning as he ran, his boots striking marble like drum beats. Down the stairs, through the courtyard, past the frightened servants shouting after him. The chapel door was half blown open, rain gushing through like a waterfall. "Evelina!" he called. His voice was nearly swallowed by the storm. Inside, she was struggling to hold up a fallen beam that had crashed near the altar. Her dress clung to her, soaked through, her hair stuck to her face. She looked up as he burst through the door, her eyes wide with shock and relief. "Your Grace, please, the letters." "Forget the letters," he shouted, crossing to her in 2 strides. "You'll be crushed." Another crack of thunder, another splintering sound. He seized her arm just as the beam gave way completely, pulling her clear. The crash shook the floor, scattering wood and glass. The smell of rain and dust filled the air. For a long moment, they simply stood there, breathing hard, the world around them trembling. Rain fell through the broken roof, glinting like shards of light between them. "You're bleeding," he said, seeing a cut on her arm. He tore a strip from his sleeve and pressed it against the wound. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar surge of something he thought long dead. Evelina looked up at him, truly looked, and saw not the Duke, not the legend whispered by the servants, but the man beneath. His hair plastered to his forehead, his face streaked with rain and soot, his eyes raw with emotion. "Why did you come?" she whispered. He froze. The question hit deeper than she could know. He should have said duty. He should have said to save a foolish servant, but the truth rose before he could stop it. "Because I couldn't lose you too." Her breath caught. The storm seemed to pause around them, as though the sky itself waited for what came next. "I told you I would pray for your peace," she said softly. "But perhaps you came to find it yourself." His jaw tightened, but his eyes softened. "I don't deserve your prayers, Miss Hart." "Then I will keep offering them," she said, "until you do." He looked at her, really looked, and something inside him cracked open, like the beam that had fallen between them. Without thinking, he drew her close, shielding her as another gust of wind burst through the broken roof. She trembled, her hands against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart, the same heart he had sworn was dead. For a long, suspended moment, the storm raged, but neither moved. The sound of rain became a song, the thunder a drumbeat, the cold air around them alive with unspoken words. When he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper against her hair. "I swore never to love again," he said, "but I fear I've already broken that vow." Evelina pulled back just enough to meet his gaze. There were tears in her eyes, though the rain disguised them. "Then let the heavens forgive you," she said, "for I never will." A flash of lightning filled the chapel, illuminating them in its silver glow, a soldier and a servant, both scarred, both trembling, both alive. And when the light faded, he was still holding her. Not as a savior holds the saved, but as a man who has found the last piece of his own redemption. The storm passed some time before dawn, but its memory lingered in the manor. Puddles in the courtyards, broken branches on the cliffs, a scent of salt and wet earth in the corridors. The servants whispered of miracles that morning, how the chapel had nearly fallen but stood firm, how the Duke himself had carried Miss Hart from the wreckage. They said he looked different when he brought her inside, no longer the ghost of Winthorpe, but a man struck alive by lightning itself. Evelina Hart awoke in the small guest chamber beside the infirmary. wrapped in clean linens, her arm bandaged. A faint ache pulsed in her temples, but she remembered every detail, the thunder, the crash, and the Duke's voice shouting her name through the storm. When she opened her eyes, she found him sitting beside the bed. The firelight drew soft gold across his features, tracing the edges of his scars, the exhaustion in his eyes. But for the first time since she'd known him, there was something else there, something almost human. "You should rest," he said quietly. She tried to sit up. "You saved my life." A faint wry smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You make it sound as though you didn't risk it first. What possessed you to run into a collapsing chapel?" "The letters," she murmured. "They're pieces of you, Your Grace. I couldn't let them burn." He exhaled slowly, staring into the fire. "They were already ashes, Miss Hart. You should not have—" He stopped, the words dying in his throat. "No, I should not have let you face that storm alone." For a long moment, neither spoke. Rain tapped softly at the window, as though the storm had not fully left, but now came only to listen. "You spoke last night," she said finally, her voice trembling. "You said you couldn't lose me too. Did you mean it?" He turned to Yartio. Her, and she saw the battle behind his eyes, pride against fear, grief against desire. "Yes," he said at last, "and that frightens me more than the war ever did." Her breath caught. "Why?" "Because I buried one woman I loved," he whispered, "and I told myself I'd never endure that pain again. But every day you are near, I feel my defenses falling. I hear your voice in the corridors. I see light where there was only shadow, and I hate it." He broke off, his hand tightening against the armrest. "I hate that I can't command my heart the way I once commanded soldiers." Evelina's eyes softened. "Love does not obey orders, Your Grace." He gave a bitter laugh. "Then it's mutiny." "It's mercy," she said quietly. He looked at her, startled. "Mercy?" "Yes," she said. "You've carried your punishment long enough. You've lived in the ruins of guilt because you thought that's what she would have wanted. But no one who loves truly wishes for suffering to be eternal." Her words found him unguarded, and he could not look away. "You speak as though you knew her." "I know you," Evelina said softly, "and that is enough." For the first time, the Duke's composure faltered. His throat worked, his eyes shining with a pain too long denied. He leaned forward, his voice raw. "When Helena died, I swore I'd never again build a life that could be taken from me. And yet, here you are, Miss Hart, building one around me without asking my leave." She smiled faintly. "Then revoke my permission, if you wish." He stared at her, speechless. The firelight flickered between them, painting their faces in gold and shadow. He reached out as if to touch her, then hesitated, the soldier inside him warring with the man who was learning to live again. When his fingers finally brushed hers, it was as though the storm outside had found its calm within that single gesture. His hand was rough, scarred, but it trembled with reverence. "I don't know if I can give you what you deserve," he said. "My heart is not new. It's broken glass and old regrets." Evelina's eyes glistened. "Then I'll be careful not to bleed." That simple, impossible answer undid him. He stood abruptly, turning away toward the fire, as though afraid she might see the tears he could no longer contain. "I don't understand you," he murmured. "Why would you care for a man like me?" She rose, still weak but steady, and came to stand beside him. "Because you remind me that even broken things can protect what they love." He turned then, and for a moment their faces were close, too close. She could see every flicker of emotion in his eyes, could feel his breath catch as though standing on the edge of confession. "Evelina." The sound of her name on his lips was like a vow itself. But before he could speak again, Clara's small voice called from the hall, breaking the spell. Evelina stepped back. Quickly, cheeks flushed. "I should go," she whispered. He nodded, forcing composure. "Yes, of course." Yet as she turned, he caught her hand one last time. His thumb brushed the bandage he had tied around her wrist. "Keep this," he said softly. A reminder of storms survived. She looked at him, the man who had once sworn never to love again, and saw, for the first time, not the soldier or the Duke, but the heart beneath both. When she left, he remained by the fire, her touch lingering like warmth in the coldest part of him. And though he would not admit it aloud, the Duke of Winthorpe had fallen, not into ruin, but into love. The following days drifted in a strange, delicate peace, the kind that comes after a storm, when the air smells of rain and rebirth, and every heartbeat carries the quiet promise of something new. The servants of Winthorpe Manor moved differently now, lighter, as though even their steps dared to make sound again. The Duke's moods had softened, though none would have dared say so aloud. And Evelina Hart, ever composed, carried a secret warmth she could neither hide nor fully name. Still, between her and Duke Alaric Blackwell, a fragile distance remained. It was not born of anger, but of awe, as if both knew they stood at the edge of something sacred and were afraid to break it. One gray afternoon, while Clara studied by the hearth, Evelina found herself wandering the west wing, the part of the manor no one spoke of. Dust clung thick on every surface. The air smelled faintly of cedar and memory. Then she saw it. A door carved with roses and gilded edges, locked tight with a heavy latch. The music room. Mrs. Holloway had once warned her never to enter. "It's His Grace's only command that still stands," the housekeeper had said. "No one plays in that room. Not since—" She hadn't needed to finish. Evelina knew the rest. Now, drawn by something she could not resist, Evelina traced her fingers along the door. Her touch stirred a faint echo from within, or perhaps it was only her heart that made the sound. She turned to leave when she heard footsteps behind her. "Curiosity," came the Duke's voice, low and quiet, "can be dangerous in this house." She turned quickly. "Your Grace, forgive me. I didn't mean to intrude." Alaric's expression was unreadable. He stood at the end of the hall, his dark coat blending with the shadows, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the door. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he stepped forward, the keys in his hand catching the light. "You want to know what silence costs," he said. "Very well, come inside." He turned the key, and the old lock gave way with a sound like a sigh. Inside, the room was breathtaking even beneath its neglect. A grand piano sat in the center, its lacquer dulled with dust. Sunlight filtered through tall, veiled windows, illuminating sheets of yellowed music scattered across the floor. Cobwebs hung from the corners, but the air still remembered beauty. Evelina's breath caught. "It's lovely." "It was her sanctuary," Alaric said quietly. "Helena's. She played every morning. This house was never silent when she lived." He crossed to the piano, his fingers brushing the keys as if afraid they might shatter. "The day she died, I ordered this room sealed. I told myself that silence was loyalty, that to let music return would be betrayal." He pressed a single key. The sound was faint but pure. The note lingered, trembling in the air between them. "But lately," he murmured, "I've begun to wonder if she would have hated me for it." Evelina stepped closer, her eyes gentle. "She loved you, Your Grace. I think she'd have wanted this house to sing again." He turned to her then, not as a duke to a servant, but as a man to the one person who could reach him. His eyes softened. "And if I asked you to be the one to bring that sound back?" Evelina hesitated, her hand trembling as she looked at the piano. "It's not my place." "It is now," he said, his voice firm but tender. Slowly, she sat. Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant at first, then certain. The first note rang clear as glass, then another, a melody rising like dawn breaking through storm clouds. The Duke closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he let himself listen. The sound filled the room, threading through every corner of the manor that had forgotten how to breathe. Evelina played softly, the tune neither mourning nor joyous, something between the two, something human. It was the sound of forgiveness finding form. When she finished, she turned toward him, her chest rising and falling with quiet emotion. "Does it hurt?" she asked. He opened his eyes, tears glistening but unshed. "Yes," he said softly, "but not as much as silence did." She smiled faintly. "Then you're healing, Your Grace." He moved closer, the air between them charged, fragile. "No," he said, "we're healing." At that moment, Mrs. Holloway paused in the corridor outside, the faint strains of music reaching her ears. Her eyes widened and then softened with disbelief. "The house is singing again," she whispered. And indeed it was. For the first time in a decade, Winthorpe Manor lived. The walls, the halls, even the sea beyond seemed to exhale. The Duke stood beside Evelina, watching her fingers rest gently upon the ivory keys. "Will you play again tomorrow?" he asked quietly. She smiled, the faintest blush coloring her cheeks. "If you'll listen." His lips curved, the smallest, truest smile. "I've done nothing else since you arrived." The weeks that followed were unlike anything Winthorpe Manor had known in years. Once a fortress of grief, it now echoed with the sound of quiet laughter, soft footsteps, and the rustle of life returning. The servants smiled again. Fires burned longer in the hearths, and when the Duke passed through the halls, the air no longer chilled in his wake, it warmed. Yet, at the center of that quiet transformation stood Evelina Hart, whose music and courage had done what no doctor, priest, or noble could achieve. She had resurrected the spirit of the house and the heart of its master. Each morning she played in the music room, not grand performances, but humble melodies, folk songs, lullabies, hymns of grace. The Duke would often stand by the doorway, unseen, letting the notes find him like sunlight through fog. Sometimes Clara would run to her, begging to sing along, her childish voice breaking the solemn spell with innocent laughter. In those moments, even Alaric smiled. But change, true change, is never without pain. One evening, the Duke found himself in the garden after dusk. The roses his late wife had planted still bloomed pale and perfect, though untended. The scent brought back memories, not all kind. Evelina found him there, standing by the statue of the angel that marked the family crypt, his face half in shadow. "You've kept it beautiful," she said softly, stepping beside him. "I didn't," he replied. "The gardeners tend it because they're afraid not to. The roses belong to her." He turned to her then, and for a heartbeat, the veil of formality dropped. "I've built my life around ghosts, Miss Hart. Every decision, every silence, all in service to memory. But lately, I find myself wishing the past would stop haunting me." Evelina met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Then let it. The dead do not need our sorrow, Your Grace. Only our peace." He smiled faintly, a wounded smile. "And yet you, who have lost so much, still speak of peace as if it's something one can simply decide to feel." She looked toward the horizon, where the last light lingered over the sea. "Because I've learned something. Pain doesn't end when we stop mourning. It ends when we start living again." Her words struck him deeply, not as a sermon, but as a truth he had long refused to hear. For years he had equated survival with loyalty, grief with love. But now, standing beside her, the air filled with the scent of rain and roses, he felt the faint, terrifying stirrings of something far stronger than either. Love, not the polished affection of ballrooms and betrothals, but something raw, redemptive, and real. That night, he could not sleep. Her words followed him, echoing through every corridor of his mind. When dawn came, he went to the chapel, the same place where he had once sworn never to love again. The morning sun spilled through the stained glass, painting the floor in colors of fire and mercy. He knelt, for the first time in years, and whispered, "If this is betrayal, then let me be faithless." Later that day, he sought her out. She was in the garden, mending Clara's shawl, sunlight tangled in her hair. When she saw him, she rose at once, but he raised a hand. "Please," he said, his voice gentler than she had ever heard. "Don't stand on ceremony, Evelina, not with me." She hesitated, then sat again. Silence stretched between them, not awkward, but alive. "I owe you more than thanks," he said after a long moment. "You've done what no one dared. You've given this house and me something I thought lost." Her eyes flickered. "Music? Peace," he said softly. "And the courage to remember what it feels like to care." She smiled, though her hands trembled slightly. "Then perhaps my work here is done." The words hit him harder than he expected. "Done?" "My position was only temporary, Your Grace," she said gently. "You've no need of a governess anymore. The house no longer needs me." He stared at her, realization dawning slow and sharp. For all his power, for all his command of estates and men, He could not command this, could not order her to stay. "Evelina," he said quietly, "if you leave, this house will fall silent again." She met his gaze. "Then promise me you'll keep it alive. Promise you'll let it sing, even if I'm gone." His breath caught. There was strength in her words, but also something breaking beneath them, something that mirrored the ache he'd tried to bury for so long. "I cannot promise that," he said finally, "because it is you who made it sing." She looked down, her lashes wet. "You're kind, Your Grace, but the world will call it foolishness." "Let it," he said simply. The silence that followed was full of everything they could not yet say. As the sun dipped low, the Duke turned away, not out of dismissal, but to gather himself. For the first time since he'd buried his heart, he knew what he wanted, and feared he might be too late to claim it. That night, as the last of the day faded, Evelina stood by her window, looking out over the sea. A wind stirred her curtains, carrying faint notes of music from somewhere below, the Duke's piano, playing the lullaby she had once taught his daughter. Her lips parted in disbelief. And downstairs, in the glow of candlelight, the Duke sat alone at the piano, his hands trembling as he played. The melody faltered, imperfect, but it was his, a promise in sound. For love was no longer something he feared. It was something he fought for. The next morning dawned golden, not the pale, hesitant light of spring, but a radiant warmth that spilled across the sea and soaked into the stones of Winthorpe Manor. It was as if the house itself had exhaled, releasing years of sorrow into the air. The storm had passed. The silence was gone. Yet, for all the light around her, Evelina Hart felt an ache she could not name. Her trunk was packed, her few belongings, the Bible, the faded photograph, the folded sheet of her mother's lullaby, were neatly tied with ribbon. Her employment had ended, her wages sealed in an envelope upon her desk. She told herself this was right. Servants did not linger where hearts had begun to tangle with nobility. Still, as she looked out the window toward the sea, something inside her whispered that leaving this place would mean leaving a part of herself behind, the part that had dared to live again. Downstairs, the Duke moved like a man burdened with purpose. His usual composure was gone, replaced by a restless urgency that set the whole household whispering. He ignored their stares. He had been silent long enough. When he reached the entry hall, Mrs. Holloway met him, wringing her hands. "Your Grace, Miss Hart is preparing to depart. I know," he said, his voice steady but strained. "Where is she?" "In her chambers, sir. Shall I?" "No, I'll go." He turned before the housekeeper could protest, his boots echoing across the marble as he climbed the stairs. The corridors felt different now, no longer tomb-like, but trembling with anticipation. He found Evelina standing by the window, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes on the horizon. For a moment, he said nothing. The light caught in her hair, and he thought she looked less like a servant and more like something holy, a living prayer. "Leaving so soon?" he asked quietly. She turned, startled. "Your Grace, I thought that I would let you go without a word." She hesitated. "It's best, I think. For both of us." He stepped closer, his voice low. "You've given me peace, Evelina. You've given me reason. And now you think leaving will protect that?" Her lips parted, but he continued. "You were right that this house needed music again. But what you didn't know," his voice cracked slightly, "is that I needed you to remember how to live again." She shook her head, her eyes glistening. "Your Grace, you owe me nothing. You've already repaid me with kindness." "Kindness?" he echoed, his tone deepening. "Do you think what I feel for you is kindness?" The silence between them thickened, alive with everything unspoken. Then softly he said, "You've haunted me, Evelina. Every note you played, every word you spoke, it followed me into every empty room. I thought I was cursed to remember the dead, but now I fear I'll never stop remembering you." Her hand trembled at her side. "You mustn't say such things. You're a duke. I'm a woman who made me feel human again," he interrupted. "A woman whose courage shamed my fear." He stepped closer until there was barely a breath between them. "Do you know why I vowed never to love again?" She shook her head, barely able to breathe. Because love once took everything from me, he said, and then you came and gave it back without asking for anything in return. Tears welled in her eyes. You cannot mean this. The world, let the world judge, he said, his voice fierce. It already did when it thought a man could not break twice and still stand. He reached for her hand, slowly, reverently, as though afraid she might vanish. Evelina Hart, I once swore before God that my heart was buried with my wife. But if I've learned anything from you, is that love is not a grave. It's a resurrection. Her tears fell freely now. Your Grace. Alaric, he said gently, say my name. She hesitated, then whispered, Alaric. The sound of it undid him. He drew her closer, his hand cupping her face. The room seemed to blur, the sea, the walls, the world itself, until there was only the two of them, standing where grief once ruled, now bathed in light. Stay, he whispered. Not as a servant, not as a governess. Stay as the woman who made me whole. For a long, trembling heartbeat, Evelina said nothing. Then she smiled through her tears. Only if you promise never to silence the music again. He let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sob. Never again. And when he kissed her, soft, reverent, full of every word they had never dared speak, the bells of Winthorpe Chapel began to ring below. Clara, somewhere in the courtyard, laughed and clapped her hands, unaware of what miracle her home had just witnessed. The servants whispered that day that the Duke had broken his vow. But those who saw his eyes when he walked hand in hand with Evelina knew better. He had not broken it, he had fulfilled it. For love, once lost to the grave, had returned to the living, and this time it would stay.